All right, me. It is February 13th, I think. Um, and I've just finished reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road. I believe Pulitzer Prize winner in 2003, 5, maybe? I don't remember. It's reading wise, for me, it's weird because this was a book that I've taken on the senior trip I am chaperoning, and it was meant to last for the week, and I read it in one day. But that's mostly just because our flight was at 5 in the morning, and then we had like 4 hours of just sitting at the hotel before we could actually check in. So that's that, right? So I was able to read a whole lot. This is the second time I've read this book. The first time I read it, I was in 8th grade, I think. Shout out to Mrs. Wagner, my homeroom teacher, for wanting me to read this book and then not getting anything from it because I was in 8th grade and I thought I was way smarter than I was. But I read it again, and I read it again under the deliria of sleeplessness and sleep loss, so hopefully this will make sense. But The Road, Cormac McCarthy, does a lot of really interesting things, right? First of all, we have this immense depersonalization, right? And we saw this kind of with The Alchemist, what was by Paulo Coelho, is that who the author is? But The Alchemist, right? In which we kind of strip down the body of the story outline, the story elements. This is much more a depersonalization in the sense that we refuse to name any of our characters, right? It is the man and the boy and the wife and the men. We refuse to name any of our characters, right? And the reason for this is mostly just down to the apocalyptic setting that The Road takes place in, right? In a lot of apocalyptic literature, right, it's generally about the neo-government that gets put into place and then fighting against that, or it is in the immediate aftermath of the apocalypse, right? At least that's what I tend to see within apocalyptic type literature. This, however, is taking place years after the initial events, right? We learn that the man had a wife who gave birth either right after the beginning of the apocalypse or was pregnant right after the beginning of the apocalypse. And the boy is now 5, 6, 7, maybe. Maybe even 10, 11, right? It's hard to really understand because of this depersonalization, which comes from, right, its setting, right? Years after the apocalyptic standpoint, we have lost all sense of self, right? It is no longer, right? If we think about, good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which isn't always correct, but gives us a good baseline or guideline to understand some of these things, right? Because we're not meeting some of the basic necessities of thinking and living, we are just surviving, right? Which then means that we can't easily or readily move up those tiers, right? That's not to say it's not possible, right? Obviously, right? But especially with those first two steps in regards to like food, shelter, water, right? If we don't have access to those, it makes it incredibly difficult to have access to any of the other steps of the hierarchy. And so we have this immense depersonalization, right? We don't understand what it is to be a person because we are so stuck. We are so stuck on what it means to survive, right? And then the other thing is that we have removed the majority of conventional grammar linguistics out of the window and grammar usage. We still have our like end for sentences, so periods, question marks, exclamation points. We still have some commas for contractions, but we don't have a lot of our commas. We don't have a lot of our any other type of like quotation marks and things like that, any other punctuation that would give us a guide as a reader. That's all taken away, right? Which then makes it at points really hard to read, because we do have these back and forths in which, if we were looking at a more traditional stylized novel, it would be a lot easier to follow. But because we are following McCarthy's, where we have this complete absolute breakdown of society, which also means breakdown of rules, which means breakdown of grammar rules, right? So it's a really, really fascinating way to approach it, right? But that's all of the just reading portion and like getting used to the book. The story itself, right? It's an incredible story, right? It's inherently about act of mercy versus act of hope, right? And that's really kind of how I break this down. Because we have this fight that occurs about midway through the book it's a flashback between the man and his wife, and the wife takes her own life, right? And there's an argument about what they need to do about the boy, and the wife wants to also take the life of the boy, right? Because it is more merciful to kill the boy now, right, than it is to hope that he survives, right, and hope that we can get through this, right? Versus the man who argues for the hope side of things, right? That by being able to keep this boy alive, it somehow builds hope then for, future generations, that we can get through this, that everything's going to work out in the end, right? But then we also fight hope a lot, right? We have this whole, constant thing of where they're constantly fighting, battling death, right? Not from being killed in the sense that someone's going to murder them, but rather because there are so few resources for them to use at any given basis, right? And so they can't survive, right? And that's what's really what's killing them, right? So that's that, right? That's really the whole main point. I would say main argument of the book is mercy versus hope, right? Which then also comes about again at the very end, in which the man has been dealing with a sickness throughout the entire book, eventually succumbs to the sickness, and dies in his sleep. And the boy is then left to deal with and figure out what to do. And he goes back out to the road, and there's a man there, and the man and his family effectively take him in, right? And right, there's great hope there, in which, right, it's about the continuation of survival, and that there is goodness in the world, and that even if people can't provide now, they will be able to provide in the future, right? Or they will be able to benefit society in the future, right? Versus what the merciful side of this would be, which would be to let the son mourn, right? And to let the son, actually fully understand what has happened, right? But then that means that in the end, right, even though that might be more positive for the boy in the immediate, it then becomes an issue where then the boy can't live afterwards, right? So that's that, right? Lots of hope versus mercy kind of discussion, right? The immediate gratitude versus the hopefully long-term benefits, right? Which is also just the general theme, right? Because what we see and what actually comes up, and it's a part that gets glossed over really, really quickly, but the man is scavenging through a barn, through an old hardware store, and he comes across like a whole bunch of seed packets that are, you know, flowers and you know, whatnot. And his immediate thought is to throw them away, because who needs these? Who would care about these, right? But this goes back into the whole, right, immediate need versus long-term success, right? In which the apocalypse has happened, right, and everything has been destroyed, right? And what has happened is, as described, the man basically breaks up the world into good guys and bad guys, which is partially an issue, which we can talk about in a second. But, right, he does this thing in which, like, he recognizes that what needs to happen is like long-term planning for things, right? It is completely possible and viable, and he sees this a couple times throughout, right? With like the apple orchard, and with the bunker that he finds with the boy, right? Is that there's possibility for long-term success and long-term planning in this that could then get this out of the apocalypse. But, right, that gets overshadowed by the immediate pressing need and the immediate gratification that people would like, right? And we see this argument happen through the cannibals, right? I don't remember what they referred to them as the book, but it's basically just roaming cannibals that stop, capture people, and then keep them until they're ready to eat them. Or in one instance, they have this pregnant woman who gives birth, and they immediately eat the fetus, right? Which doesn't inherently make sense for food conservation wise of why you would do that, but in the sense of, we refuse to feed one more mouth, right? Then I guess that makes sense in terms of cannibalism. But, you know, in reality wise, right, it would be much better to just eat the food rather than have to give the pregnant woman more food so that the baby can grow, so that then you can eat the baby. I don't know. That's just me thinking about cannibalism. Right, but we have this because there's such a huge violent portion of the world that is so focused on the immediate needs and this immediate worship of death and the apocalypse, that they then refuse to have any sort of long-term planning, which could possibly save humanity, right? We see that this is a thing that also came up in The Book Thief, right? In which there's the whole plot of them stealing the apples and stealing potatoes, and like the immediate pressing need for these people is that they need to eat right now, right? Long-term wise, it is more beneficial for the farmers who to grow and plant and be able to harvest everything, because that's the economy goes around, and therefore people can then make more money. But right, that inherently doesn't overrule the fact that they need to eat now, right? And that's another argument, that the same argument could be made, I guess, in The Road, right? That's all that, right? There's a lot of religious undertones in here, right? The boy can be viewed as more or less a symbol of God, right? Of a being that has set into motion something that is incredibly powerful and gives hope to the world, right? As the man talks about a couple different times, right? It is the boy that is keeping him alive, right? He would have died long ago if it were not for the boy that exists. But right, the boy also in a lot of ways is powerless to stop what has come into motion, right? Or once something has already been set in the mind of the man, he cannot change it no matter what he says or what he provides, right? Which provides a lot of religious undertones, right? There's also the character Eli. I don't know much about Eli in the Bible. I'm vaguely familiar with the movie, The Book of Eli, which I don't think is very accurate. But right, we have this religious undertone with Eli and that whole connection that gets made, right, about giving mercy to this one person, even if they cannot benefit you in any way, shape, or form. Which then extends into this kind of constant feed, right? Which also harkens back into this immediate versus long-term issue that's going on through the entire novel, right? Is we get into one of these final scenes in which the boy and the man are walking along the beach, and they've been camped out at this beach for quite a long time. And they come back after the walk, and they find that all of their stuff has been stolen, right? They have like weeks worth of food that they've managed to find and store, right? They have all of their like warm weather stuff and all of that, and it gets stolen, and the man hunts down the person who stole it, right? And it gets in this whole thing of the man wants the cart back, wants everything back, and then eventually forces the man to then give up his clothes and his shoes, right? This is a man who's been outcast from society already. As described, he was probably outcasted from one of the religious death cults, and so he has absolutely nothing to turn to whatsoever. And in the man's vision of this is about, showing the situation that the man and the boy have been put into by the thief, right? By having absolutely nothing at this point, right? He refuses to shoot the man. He holds him at gunpoint, but refuses to shoot the thief, I should say, but forces him to take off all his clothes, give up all his clothes, give up his shoes, and then takes everything. The boy recognizes this as, right, you've been saying that we're the good guys the entire time, but you just killed him in a different way. You killed him by omission, by absence, right? You have, instead of giving him the mercy of killing him immediately because he has nothing else to do, you have given him the long-term horror of having nothing and then starving to death in some way, right? And the boy gets really upset about this, right? Because it calls into question this whole thing of what is good guy versus bad guy, right? Because in simple terms, right, it's good guys do the good thing, and bad guys do the bad thing, and bad guys hurt us. But this is an instance, right, in which someone has hurt you, but you have to show them mercy by letting them learn their lesson and then moving on and not harming them anyway, right? So that's that, right? Anything else about the book to talk about with the road? I think that's it. That's all I want to talk about with Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And that's that.